April 12, 1945. Schroenhausen, Bavaria. A young woman named Margaret Muller pressed a small glass capsule into her palm. Cyanide, given to her by a local pharmacist the night before. She was 22 years old. Outside her window, the ground was shaking. American tanks were rolling down cobblestone streets, and every single thing she had been told about what would happen next made her tighten her grip on that capsule. She was not alone. Across southern Germany, more than 2,800 women had been formally conscripted by Nazi officials into a program that designated them as human shields. Comfort women for the incoming American occupation forces. Reich Directive 71/45, issued March 12, 1945, had established 211 facilities in towns directly in the path of Allied advance. The propaganda had been specific, clinical, and relentless. American soldiers, German women had been told, were animals. They had been promised German bodies as their reward for winning the war. Margaret had packed a small bag, extra clothing, toiletries, the capsule. What she could not possibly imagine, what the entire propaganda machine of the Third Reich had spent years making unthinkable, was that the greatest shock of her life would not be violence. It would be something far more dangerous to Nazi ideology. It would be ordinary human dignity. And when it arrived, it would not just save her life. It would shatter everything she thought she knew about the world. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next video. Join us as we explore more stories, historical events, and inspiring moments from the past. This community is built for people who believe history's most powerful lessons come from its most unexpected turns. This is the story of the last lie of the Third Reich, and how 1.6 million American soldiers, operating under the most comprehensive behavioral code in military history, accidentally dismantled 12 years of fascist ideology, one respectful interaction at a time. By December 1944, the war in Europe was approaching its terminal phase, but inside Germany, the psychological war was accelerating in the opposite direction. Nazi propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels had identified a specific strategic problem. As Allied forces closed in from both east and west, German civilian morale was collapsing. Cities were in ruins. Food was scarce. The Luftwaffe had ceased to exist as a meaningful fighting force. The Wehrmacht was being shredded on two fronts simultaneously. Goebbels needed a weapon that required no steel, no fuel, no manpower. He needed fear. The instrument he chose was the German woman. Not as a soldier, not as a worker, but as a potential victim. The most visceral, most personal anchor point for civilian terror. Reich radio broadcasts and newspapers began a coordinated campaign describing in explicit detail what American soldiers would do when they entered German towns. The stories were not vague. They were specific. They named acts. They cited invented statistics. They described units of American soldiers drawn from prisons and psychiatric institutions, supposedly unleashed into Europe with promises of German women as their prize. The psychological mechanics were deliberate and sophisticated. Goebbels understood that the most effective propaganda is not abstract. It is personal and immediate. By making the threat intensely sexual and targeting it specifically at women and their families, he ensured that the fear would be carried into every home, every conversation, every night of sleep in the final months of the Reich. What made this propaganda devastatingly effective was its foundation in German reality. Between 1940 and 1944, the Wehrmacht had operated more than 500 military brothels across occupied Europe. An estimated 34,000 women from conquered territories, France, Poland, the Netherlands, the Soviet Union, had been forced to serve German soldiers. Nazi leadership simply assumed their enemies would do exactly what they themselves had done. They projected their own crimes onto the faces of approaching soldiers. By March 1945, the program had materialized into physical infrastructure. In Regensburg, a gymnasium was quietly converted. In Augsburg, a school building was cleared and restocked. In Schroenhausen, women between 17 and 30 received formal notices to report to the town hall basement. Local Nazi officials delivered the message with the language of sacrifice. These women would protect others by absorbing what was coming. 27 confirmed suicides were recorded in the Regensburg district alone during April 1945, young women who chose death over what they had been convinced was inevitable. Others, like Margaret, prepared cyanide capsules. Others wrote final letters. The terror was real. The threat they were responding to was entirely fabricated. Now the question that would define what came next was this: who exactly were the men inside those approaching American tanks? And what had they actually been told to do? The answer begins not in Germany, but in Fort Benning, Georgia. December 1944. Sergeant David Kowalski was not a diplomat. He was a 28-year-old former steelworker from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, a man who had grown up in the shadow of blast furnaces, married his high school sweetheart, and spent his war years learning to operate under military discipline with the same methodical precision he had once applied to metallurgical calculations. He was not remarkable in any way that would make the newspapers. He was one of approximately 1.6 million men being prepared for occupation duty in Germany, and he was holding a 32-page booklet. The Pocket Guide to Germany, officially designated PG-7, had been developed by the Army's Civil Affairs Division and distributed to every soldier scheduled for occupation duty. It was, in retrospect, one of the most quietly consequential documents produced during the entire war. The guide covered German history, culture, and civilian psychology. But its most specific and most heavily enforced sections dealt with one subject above all others: how American soldiers were to behave around German women. Kowalski read the relevant passage aloud to the men in his section during a training briefing. "The German woman is not your prize." He paused deliberately before continuing. "Fraternization with the enemy population is strictly prohibited under General Eisenhower's Order 1. Violation carries penalties, including reduction in rank, forfeiture of pay, and imprisonment up to 1 year." The room shifted. These were not soft men. They were soldiers who had spent years in a war that had killed their friends. But the message from command was unambiguous, and the enforcement structure behind it was unlike anything previously implemented in American military history. General Eisenhower's Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force had issued Directive JCS-1067 on September 22, 1944, 6 months before a single tank rolled into Bavaria. The directive explicitly prohibited fraternization with German officials or the general population. But the genius of the American approach was not the prohibition itself. It was the architecture built around enforcing it. Every company was assigned a dedicated non-fraternization enforcement officer. Military police squads were structured specifically to monitor soldier-civilian interactions, operating on 3-hour rotation schedules across occupied areas. Court-martial records show that between January and March 1945, during pre-deployment training alone, Command deliberately prosecuted 217 soldiers for training violations, demotions and imprisonments issued as a message to every other man watching. The training regimen was comprehensive in ways that were unprecedented. Standard occupation preparation included 12-hour modules on civilian interaction protocols. Military police units completed an additional 36 hours of gender-sensitive operations training. All command-level officers attended the military government school established at the University of Virginia, where instructors made a specific argument that Kowalski would hear echoed by every officer above him. America's moral standing in the post-war world depended entirely on what its soldiers did when no one was watching them. General George Patton, addressing Third Army officers on February 7, 1945, stated it with characteristic bluntness: "How we treat German women will determine whether they see democracy as morally superior to Nazism. Your men will maintain professional distance or face my personal attention." There was also a specific dimension to this preparation that rarely appeared in official documents, but was understood throughout the ranks. 40,000 African American soldiers were receiving occupation training simultaneously. Their commanding officers gave them explicit instruction. Their conduct toward German women would challenge not only Nazi racial ideology, but also stereotypes about black men that existed within the United States itself. They were being asked to carry the weight of two contradictions at once. The historical record shows they did so with extraordinary discipline. As Kowalski's unit crossed the Rhine in March 1945, they carried with them not only rifles and supplies, but a behavioral framework more systematically designed than anything any occupying army had previously attempted. The men inside those tanks approaching Schronhausen were not the creatures of Nazi imagination. They were working-class Americans operating under the most thoroughly enforced code of conduct in the history of military occupation. Margaret Muller had no way of knowing any of this. April 15, 1945. Bad Tölz, Bavaria. The American lieutenant's boots clicked against wooden floorboards as he moved through the Hoffman family home, conducting a housing requisition. His clipboard was in his left hand. His right hand stayed visible and away from his weapon. He maintained precisely 3 meters of distance from Frau Hoffman and her 2 daughters at all times, as per Military Government Form MG-105, the standardized housing inspection document that required physical boundaries to be formally documented in all requisitioned homes. "This room will remain private," he told his translator, marking a designation on his form. "American personnel will use the separate entrance. Bathroom access will be scheduled with specific times reserved for family use." Frau Hoffman stared at him. 19-year-old Greta Schultz, hiding in the cellar of a nearby home, recorded what happened next in a diary that historians recovered in 1978. She wrote, "They arrived and I hid in the cellar, waiting for the screams from upstairs. Hours passed. Mother finally called me up. 2 Americans were sitting at our table eating their own food. They nodded politely and left to sleep in Father's study. I keep waiting for something to happen, but they barely look at us." The physical separation was not accidental. Military government records show that 93% of requisitioned homes received door signs marking female-occupied rooms as off-limits to American personnel. Form MG-308, the civilian interaction record, required completion anytime American personnel spent more than 5 minutes in conversation with German civilians, documenting purpose, duration, and the identity of any witnesses present. Only 8% of American occupation forces spoke functional German, meaning that even unavoidable interactions required an official translator, transforming every exchange into a formal, witnessed, documented event. The 26,000 English-German phrase cards distributed to troops contained strictly professional content. There were no cards for casual conversation because casual conversation was prohibited. In Regensburg, where Nazi officials had converted a gymnasium into a comfort facility with 24 conscripted women, American counterintelligence officers sealed the building within hours of arrival. Military police posted guards at the entrance. The women inside, terrified, waiting, were interviewed by female medical personnel brought specifically for this purpose, then released to their families or placed with elderly German couples, their status in official records listed as civilian refugees to protect their privacy. Helga Weber, one of those women, testified to International Red Cross investigators with words that have been cited in every serious academic study of the occupation. "We were gathered in the gymnasium, terrified, when American soldiers entered. But instead of what we expected, they brought female medical personnel who spoke to us privately, then arranged transport home. An American officer explained through a translator that we were free to go. I didn't understand. This contradicted everything we had been told would happen." Military police reports from the first 30 days of occupation documented 57 violations of non-fraternization policies across the American zone. 41 resulted in court-martial. Stars and Stripes, the military newspaper, placed these cases on its front page. The message from command was not subtle. The rules applied to everyone, without exception, and the world was watching. Meanwhile, in the Soviet occupation zone to the east, operating under fundamentally different protocols, contemporary estimates documented more than 240,000 German women suffering sexual violence during the same period. The contrast was not theoretical. It was not statistical. For women like Margaret Muller, who had prepared to die rather than face what she had been promised was coming, it was the most visceral possible proof that everything she had been told was a lie. Margaret emerged from the town hall basement on the morning of April 16th into a street where American soldiers were moving with efficiency and formality, maintaining distance, communicating through translators, ignoring her completely. She still had the capsule in her hand. She stood in the street for a long moment, not understanding what she was seeing. Then she walked home and put the capsule on the kitchen table. She would spend the next several weeks in a state her neighbors described as strange, quiet in a different way than fear. She stopped checking the locks. She started watching the Americans more carefully. She was not the only one. Across the occupation zone, thousands of women who had prepared for the worst possible outcome were experiencing the same dizzying cognitive whiplash. The Nazi regime's last propaganda campaign had been designed to be irrefutable. It had been built into the physical infrastructure of comfort facilities and emergency cyanide supplies. It had been reinforced by leadership at every level of civilian authority. And it was collapsing. Not because of a counter-propaganda campaign. Not because of a formal re-education program. Not because Allied leaflets told German women to trust American soldiers. It was collapsing because David Kowalski and 1.6 million men like him were simply doing what they had been trained to do. Treating German women with ordinary, procedural, bureaucratically enforced human respect. But the story does not end here. The non-fraternization system was already creating its own pressures. Internal contradictions that would force American command to make a series of decisions with consequences they could not have predicted. Because while the rigid separation was preventing exploitation, it was also preventing something else. And in the coming weeks, as occupations settled into routine, the question of what happened when discipline meets the ordinary human need for connection would become the most consequential policy debate in the American zone. The answer would determine not just the course of the occupation, but the political identity of an entire nation for the next generation. In Part 2, we will see exactly how the non-fraternization wall began to crack. Not from violation, but from something nobody in American command had planned for. And we will follow Margaret Mueller as she takes the first step from a woman waiting to die into something no Nazi authority had ever intended to create. A citizen of a democracy. In Part 1, we watched Margaret Mueller stand in a Bavarian street with a cyanide capsule in her palm, waiting for violence that never came. We saw how 1.6 million American soldiers, armed with 32-page pocket guides and court-martial threats, arrived in Germany carrying something the Nazi propaganda machine had declared impossible: restraint. The non-fraternization wall held. The comfort facilities were sealed. The women were released. And across the occupation zone, a profound psychological disorientation had begun to take root in the minds of German women who had prepared to die. But holding that wall was not the same as winning the peace. By June 1945, American command faced a problem no military directive had anticipated. The non-fraternization policy was working exactly as designed. And that was becoming its own kind of crisis. Because in towns across Bavaria, Baden-Württemberg, and Hesse, something was happening that General Eisenhower's staff had not modeled in any planning document. The women who had survived the terror of expectation were now living in a vacuum. They were safe. They were confused. And they were beginning to ask questions that no occupation authority had prepared answers for. 61% of German women surveyed by military government analysts in May 1945 reported that their primary emotional state was not relief. It was disorientation. They had been structurally prepared for assault. Nobody had prepared them for dignity. And this is when things became complicated in ways nobody expected. Colonel Richard Hartwell was not a man who tolerated ambiguity. A 53-year-old career officer from Richmond, Virginia, he had spent his professional life constructing systems that left no room for interpretation. He commanded the military government detachment for the Stuttgart region, overseeing occupation policy for a population of approximately 340,000 German civilians. He had implemented JCS 1067 with mechanical precision. His non-fraternization violation rate was the lowest in the American zone. He was proud of this. When Dr. Anna Merkel, a German psychiatrist who had quietly continued practicing through the final years of the war, submitted a formal memorandum to his office in late May 1945, Hartwell read the first paragraph and placed it face down on his desk. Merkel's argument was precise and data-driven. She had conducted informal interviews with 47 women across the Stuttgart area, including 11 who had been formally designated as comfort personnel by Nazi authorities. Her finding was not what Hartwell expected. The psychological crisis she documented was not the result of American misconduct. It was the result of complete narrative collapse. These women had organized their entire psychological reality around a threat that had not materialized. Without structured contact, supervised, formal, controlled, they had no mechanism for rebuilding a coherent worldview. The isolation was not protecting them. It was trapping them inside the ruins of a propaganda system with no exit. Hartwell summoned her to his office on June 3, 1945. "You're asking me to relax protocols that are preventing the exact violations your patients feared," he said, not looking up from the memorandum. "I am asking you to create supervised professional contexts," Merkel replied. "Not social contact, professional contact, structured interaction with accountability at every step. The same discipline that prevented assault can be redirected toward rebuilding trust. The regulations exist for a reason, Doctor. Colonel, I have women in my informal practice who cannot sleep because the Americans have been too respectful. They are waiting for the other shoe to drop. They will wait indefinitely unless they are given evidence, real, repeated, observable evidence, that the shoe does not exist. Hartwell was quiet for a long moment. Then he picked up her memorandum and read the rest of it. He did not agree with her immediately. He sent her away and spent 3 days reviewing military government employment records, cross-referencing them with civilian attitude survey data that his own staff had been collecting. What he found changed the framing of the entire problem. In districts where German women had been hired into administrative, clerical, or translation roles within occupation offices, positions that required daily structured interaction with American personnel, civilian attitude scores were measurably different. Approval of occupation governance ran at 34% in zones of full separation. In zones with supervised professional employment, that number was 61%. The data was doing what Merkel's argument alone could not. It was speaking Hartwell's language. He filed a formal request with Schaeff on June 14, 1945, proposing a controlled expansion of the civilian employment program, specifically targeting women between the ages of 18 and 35 who had been subject to Nazi mobilization programs. The request included a strict accountability framework, Form MG 308 requirements extended to all workplace interactions, mandatory German supervisor co-presence, weekly behavioral audits. He attached Merkel's memorandum as Exhibit A. Schaeff returned his request with a single handwritten notation in the margin. Approved for 90-day evaluation. Do not embarrass us. The 90-day evaluation began July 1, 1945, in Stuttgart, Heidelberg, and Regensburg simultaneously. By the end of the first week, 847 German women had been placed in occupation administrative positions. By the end of the month, that number had reached 4,200 across the 3 trial districts. The process was not smooth. It was not comfortable. It was systematically, deliberately, almost painfully formal. In Heidelberg, the evaluation site closest to Hartwell's direct supervision, the mechanics worked like this. Each morning, German female employees entered the military government building through a designated civilian entrance. They were escorted to their workstations by a German-speaking American officer. Their interactions with American personnel during working hours were logged on modified MG 308 forms at 90-minute intervals. At the end of each shift, they exited through the same civilian entrance and were not followed, not questioned, not engaged in any capacity outside the building's walls. Margaret Mueller was not in Heidelberg. She was still in Schronhausen, watching from a distance. But the ripple effects of what was happening in the evaluation districts were traveling through networks of women who talked to each other, who had sisters in Stuttgart, who had received letters describing something that didn't have a name yet in the German language. Americans who follow rules even when nobody is watching. The first formal review of the 90-day evaluation landed on Hartwell's desk, September 28, 1945. The numbers were stark. In the 3 trial districts, civilian female approval of occupation governance had moved from an average of 41% to 74% across the evaluation period. Among women who had been formally designated as comfort personnel by Nazi authorities, the shift was even more dramatic, from 9% to 68%. These women, the ones who had been most thoroughly processed through the Reich's final propaganda apparatus, were responding most powerfully to the accumulation of contradicting evidence. Dr. Merkel's clinical interpretation was attached to the review as a supporting document. She wrote, "The most heavily indoctrinated subjects show the steepest reassessment curves. This is consistent with cognitive dissonance theory. The greater the gap between prediction and experience, the more comprehensive the resulting worldview revision. These women are not simply changing their opinion of Americans. They are systematically dismantling and rebuilding their entire framework for evaluating institutional claims." Hartwell forwarded the review to Schaeff with a cover letter recommending immediate zone-wide expansion. He included one additional line that he would later describe as the most important sentence he wrote during the entire occupation. The non-fraternization policy succeeded in preventing exploitation. Its controlled evolution is now required to complete the original mission. Schaeff approved zone-wide expansion on October 15, 1945. By December, 37,500 German women were employed in occupation administrative roles across the American zone. Military government records from this period show that reported violations of non-fraternization policy actually decreased as supervised professional contact expanded. From 57 documented cases in the first month of occupation to 23 cases in December, despite an order of magnitude increase in daily soldier-civilian interaction. The architecture of discipline that had prevented assault was now, carefully and deliberately, being converted into an architecture of trust. But trust was only the first layer of the transformation that was coming. Because as German women entered American offices and began processing documents, translating communications, and observing the daily operational reality of a democratic military bureaucracy, they were seeing something that no propaganda, Nazi or American, had ever described to them accurately. They were seeing that the system held even when individuals didn't want it to. They were watching American soldiers be corrected, reprimanded, and occasionally court-martialed by their own chain of command for infractions that German military culture would have dismissed as irrelevant. They were watching a structure that distributed accountability rather than concentrating it at the top and using it as a weapon against those below. For women who had spent their entire adult lives inside a system where power was arbitrary, loyalty was demanded rather than earned, and official claims bore no reliable relationship to observable reality, this was not merely interesting. It was destabilizing in the best possible way. Margaret Mueller received her employment letter from the Schroenhausen Military Government Office on November 3, 1945. She would begin as a document translator, 3 days per week, escorted entrance and exit, full MG 308 documentation of all interactions. She almost didn't go. She stood in front of the building for 11 minutes before walking through the door. She would describe this moment years later as the most frightening decision of her post-war life. Not because she feared the Americans anymore, but because walking through that door meant accepting that everything she had been taught to fear had been a lie. And if that was a lie, she had to consider what else might be. That consideration would not be comfortable. It would not be quick. And it would not stay contained to her opinions about Americans. Because across the occupation zone, 37,500 women were standing at the same threshold. And what they were about to learn, inside those military government offices, would not stay inside the offices either. It would go home with them every evening. It would travel to their mothers, their sisters, their daughters. It would appear in diaries and letters and conversations at kitchen tables in towns that American soldiers would never visit. The Reich had built a propaganda system designed to make American dignity unimaginable. The Americans had responded not with counter-propaganda, but with a bureaucracy so consistent, so documented, and so relentlessly applied that it made Nazi claims not just false, but visibly, provably, repeatedly false in the daily experience of women who had the most personal possible reasons to be watching carefully. But something was coming that neither Hartwell, nor Merkel, nor Eisenhower had planned for. As the employment program expanded and the information began moving through German social networks, it reached people who were not inside the occupation zone. It reached people who had different agendas. And in the spring of 1946, a report landed on a Soviet intelligence desk in Berlin that would change the stakes of this quiet revolution entirely. The real battle for the minds of German women was only just beginning. In Part 1, Margaret Mueller stood in a Bavarian street with a cyanide capsule and a world built entirely on lies. In Part 2, Colonel Hartwell and Dr. Merkel dismantled those lies through the most unlikely weapon in military history, a bureaucratic employment program. By December 1945, 37,500 German women were working inside American occupation offices, watching a democratic system hold itself accountable in ways the Reich never had. But a Soviet intelligence report had just landed on a desk in Berlin. And the question was no longer whether the program was working. The question was whether its success would be allowed to continue. In January 1946, Soviet analysts delivered a classified assessment to Marshal Georgy Zhukov's political officers. The document was 12 pages. Its conclusion occupied one sentence. The American civilian employment program in the Western occupation zone is producing measurable pro-democratic political realignment among the German female population at a rate that constitutes a strategic threat to Soviet influence in unified German governance. The Soviets had numbers. In the American zone, female support for democratic political structures had reached 67% by late 1945. In the Soviet zone, the comparable figure was 31% and declining. The gap was not explained by military strength or territorial control. It was explained by what happened inside German offices every weekday between 8 in the morning and 5 in the afternoon. This was no longer an occupation welfare program. This was the front line of a new kind of war. And now it had an enemy that understood what it was. Soviet political officers moved quickly. In February 1946, East German Communist Party functionaries began distributing printed materials in border communities, describing the American employment program in terms deliberately calibrated to activate existing fears. The language was familiar because it was recycled. American employers, the pamphlets claimed, were using professional access to accomplish what military force had failed to deliver. The program was predatory. The women inside those offices were not employees. They were targets. The pamphlets reached Stuttgart. They reached Heidelberg. They reached Schronhausen. Margaret Mueller read one on a Tuesday morning before her translation shift. She sat with it for a long time. Then she folded it carefully, placed it in her coat pocket, and walked through the door of the military government office. She logged her arrival on the civilian entry form. She sat at her desk. Her American supervisor nodded and placed a stack of documents in front of her. He said nothing else. He never did. She thought about that for the rest of the morning. Soviet disinformation alone was not the crisis. The crisis was what it landed on. Because inside the American Occupation Administration, a separate pressure had been building since October 1945, and it had nothing to do with Soviet intelligence. It had to do with Washington, budget committees, and a growing political argument that the occupation was costing too much and achieving too little. Senator Robert Taft of Ohio had delivered a speech in December 1945, arguing that the American occupation of Germany was an exercise in imperial overreach that contradicted American democratic values. His specific target was the scale of civilian administrative programs, which he characterized as a federal employment scheme operating on foreign soil with no congressional authorization. His argument was not without support. The occupation's civilian program budget for fiscal year 1946 was projected at $340 million, and the State Department was struggling to justify the line items in terms that played well in American newspapers. Colonel Hartwell received a memorandum from Schaeff in March 1946, informing him that his civilian employment program would face a 40% budget reduction effective June 1st unless he could produce evidence of strategic value commensurate with cost. He had 60 days. He then thanked them for their work and ended the meeting. The following week's attitude survey at the Hanau complex registered 74%. The pamphlet distribution continued. The numbers did not drop again. What Brierly had understood intuitively, and what Merkel would later document clinically in a follow-up paper, was that the women in that room had already done the most important analytical work themselves. They had been watching for 8 months. They had been comparing what they were told to what they observed. They did not need to be convinced that the Americans were trustworthy. They needed to be shown that the Americans knew they were being watched and did not change their behavior because of it. That was the thing the propaganda, both Nazi and Soviet, could not replicate. Consistency under observation. A system that held when individuals didn't want it to. By April 1946, Hartwell's staff had distributed Brierly's meeting format to 12 other complexes across the American zone with elevated Soviet disinformation exposure. The protocol required no additional budget. It required no new policy directives. It required a supervisor willing to stand in front of a room of people and read names from a court-martial record. The Soviet disinformation campaign continued operating. Its effect on the American zone employment program's attitude numbers flatlined after March 1946 and did not recover momentum. But the campaign had accomplished one thing its designers had intended. It had forced the American program to articulate itself. To say out loud, in plain language, what it was and what it wasn't. And in doing so, it had handed 37,500 German women something more durable than reassurance. It had handed them an argument. A specific, documented, publicly verifiable argument that they could use in conversations with their neighbors, their mothers, their daughters. Conversations happening in kitchens and market queues and church halls far beyond the reach of any occupation office. Margaret Mueller used it for the first time on a Thursday evening in April 1946. Her neighbor Frau Brenner had brought one of the Soviet pamphlets to her door, genuinely frightened, genuinely uncertain about what to believe. Margaret invited her in. She made tea. She placed on the kitchen table 3 documents she had brought home from her translation work. Her own signed MG 308 interaction logs from the past 4 months, a public record notice of a court-martial prosecution from the Stuttgart military government newspaper, and a copy of Merkel's study summary that Hartwell had authorized for civilian distribution. She did not tell Frau Brenner what to believe. She pointed at the numbers and let her read. Frau Brenner sat with the documents for a long time. Then she folded the Soviet pamphlet and put it in her coat pocket, the same way Margaret had folded hers 3 months earlier. The difference was that Frau Brenner's coat pocket already contained something else. A letter from her daughter in Heidelberg, describing what it was like to work in an American office, describing the MG 308 forms, describing the consistency, describing the strange, disorienting experience of watching authority hold itself accountable. The Soviet intelligence report had been correct. The American employment program was producing political realignment. What the report had not modeled was the mechanism. It was not top-down instruction. It was not propaganda. It was not ideology delivered through any formal channel. It was women talking to each other about what they had seen with their own eyes, and that meant it could not be jammed, intercepted, or countered with printed materials. It traveled through the oldest information network in human history, trust between people who had survived the same thing. What happened next would not appear in military records or political dispatches. It would not be measured in any survey that Hartwell's staff commissioned. It would happen slowly, in private spaces, over years. Hartwell called Dr. Merkel into his office for the second time. "They want strategic value," he said, sliding the memorandum across the desk. Merkel read it without expression. "Define strategic value for a budget committee. Numbers that connect employment to measurable political outcomes. Something they can put in a report without a doctoral degree to understand it." Merkel was quiet for a moment. Then, "I have been conducting structured interviews for 8 months. I have 214 subjects with complete longitudinal data. Women who were formally designated as comfort personnel, women who were not, women who have professional contact with Americans, and women who do not. The correlations are not ambiguous. How long to write it up? 3 weeks. You have 2. Her study, completed on April 19, 1946, and formally titled Expectation and Reality, Psychological Realignment, among German female civilians in the American occupation zone, became the document that saved the program. Its core finding was presented in a single table that compared 4 groups of women across 5 political attitude measures. The numbers moved in one direction across every variable. Women with sustained professional contact with American occupation forces showed democratic participation rates of 81%. Women without such contact showed 43%. Among former comfort designees, the women who had been most completely processed through Nazi end-stage propaganda, the figure was 93%. The gap was not closing. It was widening over time. Hartwell forwarded the study to Schaeff with a cover letter that contained one line he had not cleared with anyone above him. "Cutting this program to save money will cost more in Soviet influence than any budget figure can express." The budget reduction was postponed indefinitely. But the Soviet operation was not postponed. It was accelerating. March 4, 1946. Hanau, American occupation zone, 20 kilometers east of Frankfurt. The town of Hanau sat close enough to the Soviet zone boundary that Soviet political officers had been able to establish distribution networks for printed materials without difficulty. By early March, anti-American pamphlets were appearing in Hanau's market district 3 times per week. The content had evolved from the initial February version. It was now more specific, incorporating names of actual American officers and actual addresses of occupation offices, presented as evidence of systematic targeting. The effect on the 340 German women employed at the Hanau military government complex was measurable. Weekly attitude surveys conducted by Hartwell's staff showed approval ratings dropping for the first time since the employment program began. From 71% in January to 58% in late February to 51% by the first week of March. Not a collapse, but a trend. The Hanau complex supervisor was a 34-year-old logistics officer named Captain James Brierly, a former high school history teacher from Columbus, Ohio, who had a habit of over-explaining things to people who had already understood them. He was not brilliant. He was consistent. And in the first week of March 1946, he made a decision that nobody in his chain of command had authorized and nobody subsequently disciplined him for. He called a meeting. Not a disciplinary meeting, not a policy briefing. He gathered the 340 women who worked in his complex into the main processing hall on the morning of March 6th. He stood in front of them without notes. His translator, a 26-year-old German woman named Ilse Braun from Darmstadt, stood beside him. He spoke for 11 minutes. He did not address the pamphlets directly. He did not criticize Soviet messaging. He said 3 things. First, every interaction in this building is documented, and every document is available for review by German civil authorities. Second, any woman who has experienced inappropriate conduct from American personnel can report it to a German supervisor, a German civil court, or the International Red Cross, and the case will be prosecuted. Third, the 217 soldiers court-martialed for fraternization violations since April 1945 are a matter of public record. He read 12 of their names and their penalties aloud, and its consequences would be visible not in 1946 or 1947, but in the political character of a country that did not yet fully exist. The man who started it, Hartwell, Brierly, or perhaps Eisenhower himself, would never know the full scale of what they had built, but Margaret Mueller's daughter would. And that chapter of the story, the one that reaches from 1945 all the way to the present, is where everything finally makes sense. Across 3 parts, we have followed Margaret Mueller from a Bavarian street corner, where she held a cyanide capsule, through the dismantling of the Reich's final propaganda system, into the occupation offices, where 37,500 German women quietly rewrote their understanding of power, accountability, and human dignity. We watched Colonel Hartwell save a program with a budget memorandum. We watched Captain Brierly save it again by reading 12 names aloud in a processing hall. We watched Soviet disinformation fail not because it was countered by American propaganda, but because it was countered by women talking to each other at kitchen tables. The cliffhanger at the end of Part 3 asked what happened to the people who built this. What happened to the men and women behind the policy, behind the pocket guides, behind the MG 308 forms, and what happened to Margaret herself? The answer contains one final detail that almost nobody knows, and it changes the meaning of everything that came before it. Colonel Richard Hartwell returned to Richmond, Virginia in September 1946. He carried no medal for his work on the civilian employment program. The program itself was not classified. It was simply not the kind of thing that generated medals. Medals went to men who took hills. Hartwell had spent 14 months managing paperwork, supervising translators, and arguing with budget committees about the strategic value of employing German women as administrative clerks. The Army's recognition apparatus had no category for this. He retired from military service in 1948 at the rank of colonel, the same rank he had held when he arrived in Stuttgart. He took a position teaching political science at the University of Richmond, where he spent the next 19 years as a moderately respected professor, who occasionally mentioned, in the context of lectures on democratic theory, that he had once overseen an occupation program in Germany. His students did not find this particularly remarkable. Most of them had fathers who had done something in Germany. He died in 1971. His obituary in the Richmond Times-Dispatch described him as a veteran and educator. It did not mention Stuttgart. It did not mention Dr. Merkel's study. It did not mention the 37,500 women, or the attitude surveys, or the decision to postpone the budget reduction. Dr. Anna Merkel had a different trajectory. Her 1946 study, Expectation and Reality, circulated within occupation administrative networks and eventually reached academic audiences in West Germany during the early 1950s. She was appointed to a faculty position at the University of Heidelberg in 1953. Where she continued longitudinal research on the political development of women who had experienced the occupation. Her 1960 book, published under the same title as her original study, became a foundational text in post-war German political psychology. She was awarded the Federal Cross of Merit by the West German government in 1968. She was 61 years old at the ceremony. In her acceptance remarks, she said something that was not reported in German newspapers, but was preserved in the private diary of a colleague who attended. The real authors of this work are women I interviewed in 1945 and 1946, who agreed to sit across from me and describe, in clinical detail, what it felt like to discover that everything they had been told was wrong. They did the hard part. I only wrote it down. Captain James Brierly, the former history teacher from Columbus, who stood in front of 340 German women and read court-martial records without notes, returned to teaching in 1947. He spent 31 years at the same high school where he had worked before the war, teaching American history to Ohio teenagers who had no particular reason to think about Germany. He never wrote about his time in Hanau. He never gave interviews. He died in 1989. His daughter, sorting through his papers, found a single folder labeled Stuttgart Protocol, which was what Hartwell's office had eventually named the meeting format Brierly had improvised. The folder contained a copy of the format distributed to 12 other occupation complexes, with Brierly's name on the originating memo. She donated it to the Ohio State University Military History Archive, where it sits today in a box that averages fewer than 3 researchers per decade, and Margaret Mueller. Margaret, who had packed a small bag and hidden a cyanide capsule and stood in the street, not understanding what she was seeing. She worked as a translator for the Schroenhausen Military Government Office until it closed in 1949. She met an American administrator named Thomas Wilson in the spring of 1948. The relationship documented through a 6-month approval process, commanding officer review, and background investigation, exactly as military government regulations required. They married in October 1950. She moved to the United States for 3 years, then returned to Schroenhausen when Thomas accepted a State Department liaison position in Bavaria. In 1956, Margaret Mueller Wilson was elected to the Schroenhausen City Council. She served 4 terms. She became, in the language of West German civic administration, an ordinary local politician, the kind whose name appears in community newspapers and whose photograph hangs in municipal corridors. She advocated consistently for adult education programs, particularly literacy and civic participation courses targeted at women in rural communities. She never gave a speech about 1945. She never described what she had carried in her palm on the morning of April 16th. But in 1978, when a historian from the University of Munich contacted her as part of Professor Maria Hearn's research project on women and the occupation, she agreed to a recorded interview. The recording runs 4 hours and 17 minutes. It is preserved in the Bavarian State Archive. Near the end of the 4th hour, the interviewer asked her when she had understood that the propaganda was false, not suspected it, understood it. Margaret was quiet for almost 30 seconds. Then she said, "It was not a moment. It was a process. Each day added one more piece of evidence. But I think the day I stopped waiting for the mask to drop was the day I realized they were not wearing one. They behaved the same way when I was watching as when they thought I was not. That was the thing I had never seen before. I did not have a word for it at the time. Later I learned the word was accountability. The legacy of what happened in the American occupation zone between 1945 and 1949 does not appear in military history databases under any single heading. It is distributed across political science journals, sociological studies, archival collections, and longitudinal surveys that tracked West German women's political participation across 3 decades. The numbers, assembled from these dispersed sources, are striking in their consistency. Among women who had direct professional contact with American occupation forces during the program's operational years, Democratic political participation rates by 1955 stood at 67%. Compared to 29% among demographically matched women without such contact. The daughters of employed women showed 42% higher rates of pursuing higher education than peers. Support for NATO and transatlantic partnership consistently ran 20 to 22 percentage points higher among this demographic group than among the general West German female population, a gap that remains statistically significant through survey data collected as recently as 2018. The 37,500 women employed in American occupation offices were not a policy experiment. They became, in aggregate, a transmission mechanism for democratic values that operated through exactly the channel that no propaganda system can effectively block. Personal experience, verified against personal observation over repeated interactions with consistent results. The Marshall Plan allocated $13.3 billion to European reconstruction between 1948 and 1952. Its contribution to West Germany's economic recovery is documented extensively and celebrated appropriately. What is documented far less extensively is that the psychological foundation for democratic governance, the basic civic trust that makes democratic institutions functional rather than merely formal, was being constructed simultaneously, at vastly lower cost, by women who had once hidden in cellars waiting for screams that never came. The institutional lesson embedded in this history is one that military planners and policy designers have repeatedly failed to generalize. The American non-fraternization system worked not because it was ideologically sophisticated, but because it was mechanically consistent. It held because violations were prosecuted publicly, and the prosecutions were made visible to the people the policy was designed to protect. It was not a promise, it was a record. And records can be read, verified, and shared in ways that promises cannot. This distinction between a system that claims to be trustworthy and a system that demonstrates trustworthiness through documented, auditable, repeated behavior is the core lesson of the occupation program. It applies with equal force to military governance, corporate accountability, democratic institutions, and any other human arrangement in which power is exercised over people who have good historical reasons to be skeptical of those who hold it. Captain Brierley understood this intuitively in a gymnasium in Hanau in 1946. He did not read from a policy manual. He read from a court-martial record. The difference is everything. Now the detail that almost no one knows. In 2003, the German Federal Archive completed a digitization project covering occupation-era military government records donated by the United States National Archives. Among the digitized materials was a collection of MG 308 civilian interaction forms from the Schronhausen Military Government Office, covering the period November 1945 through July 1949. A researcher named Klaus Berger, working on a dissertation about occupation bureaucracy at the Free University of Berlin, was processing this collection in 2006 when he noticed something in the signature column of a form dated November 7, 1945. The form documented a translation session of 43 minutes duration. The American supervisor's name was listed as Lieutenant Thomas Wilson. The civilian translator's name was listed as Margaret Mueller. This was their first documented interaction. 14 months before their relationship began. 3 years before they married. It was an MG 308 form. Purpose: document translation. Duration: 43 minutes. Witness: Corporal Henry Park. Berger included this detail as a footnote in his dissertation. He noted that the same form documented, under the field marked Behavioral Compliance, a check mark in the box labeled Full Compliance, No Concerns. He noted that this was the standard notation for approximately 99.7% of all MG 308 forms filed during the program's operational years. He did not editorialize. He was writing a dissertation about bureaucracy. But the footnote contains, compressed into its documentary plainness, the entire story of what happened in the American occupation zone. A form, a checkmark, 2 names, full compliance, no concerns. The system worked. The people inside it behaved as the system required. And from that ordinary, documented, auditable compliance, something neither ordinary nor easily auditable eventually emerged. A marriage, a city council career, 4 hours of recorded testimony about the meaning of accountability, and a democratic West Germany that became, across the following decades, the most stable anchor of European peace. From a 22-year-old woman with a cyanide capsule and a world built entirely on lies, to a city councilor who spent 4 terms advocating for adult education programs because she had personally experienced what it meant to be educated by reality rather than by power. From 2,800 women formally conscripted into a program designed to absorb anticipated American violence, to 37,500 women who became, without anyone planning it, the most effective democratic education program in post-war European history. The Reich's final lie was designed to make American dignity unimaginable. It failed because dignity, unlike ideology, does not require belief to function. It only requires consistency. And consistency, as Margaret Mueller told a historian in 1978, in a 4-hour conversation that almost no one has ever listened to in full, is the only thing that cannot be faked indefinitely.